Thomas, thank you very much for joining us here for a short interview before your lecture of
Yeah.
the afternoon.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
I think it's really great to have a preeminent theorist of democracy here and to discuss these topics at this point in history when so much has happened in the
Right.
past years. I thought we'd start to give the people an idea of your work and how it has developed so far, and then we might move to more contemporary issues.
Okay.
So first, just this very general question, right? So how did you become interested in the topic of democracy? How was this? How did you get into this part of political?
Yeah. Well, interestingly, the initial interest that I had in democracy came out of my experience with democracy. So I was a graduate student in Chicago.
Yeah.
In the 1980s.
Yeah.
And between 1982 to 1987, there were some major political events taking place in Chicago. So what happened basically was all surrounding this election of the first black mayor of Chicago,
Yeah.
which was kind of a real sea change for
Yeah.
the city. And I got involved in the politics, and I did my door-to-door campaigning and telephoning and organizing, and it was a absolutely thrilling experience. Especially in this case, it was successful, and it was we went from one success to another.
Yeah.
And it was both an exercise in democracy, but it was also an exercise in expanding democracy, because before that the black population in the southern part of Chicago didn't participate very much in politics, and the Hispanic or Latino population participated almost not at all. And what happened around this candidate for mayor, who was kind of a left-wing candidate as well, was they brought together these two groups and turned them into major forces in politics and brought them into the picture.
Mm-hmm.
So it was just a very exciting experience, and the feeling of democracy somehow or another actually working in some way. And transforming itself in a positive way. And that was, before that I'd been primarily interested in things about distributive justice and maybe some stuff about political obligation and things like that. But then I thought, no, I want to focus on democracy, because this is a really interesting political phenomenon and can potentially very exciting. And there wasn't that much written on it, at least contemporary stuff. And so that's how I got into it. It was the excitement and thrill of politics itself drew me into it.
Yeah. So the topic of equal participation is really central to the view that you've developed. Could you say more about how that fits into your view?
Yeah, the idea of equality is the sort of the leading idea. And the idea is of a conception of democratic decision making where people can participate as equals. And the thought behind it that's playing a role here is this idea that in the case of democracy, if it's working well, which is a big if, but if it's working well, what you have is a kind of what I'm calling public realization of equality. In other words, a kind of realization of equality that people can kind of roughly see that they're being treated as equals. So my thought was that this is to some degree in distinction from things like maybe distributive justice more generally, the distribution of material goods and so on, where the idea of equality is not as publicly clear in some sense, and where there's a lot of disagreement and a lot of uncertainty and so on. Democracy has this character of, well, we can rise above all these disagreements and see, well, to some degree we can see each other as equals in the context of this collective decision making. So for all of our disagreements, we can see each other as equals in this context.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of the root idea behind the notion of equal participation in the work that I have.
Yeah. So the value of equal participation is that it makes visible to members of democratic societies that their interests are taken into account.
That's right.
In the right way.
Yeah, yeah.
At the same time, there's in your work also an emphasis on very broad participation, right? It cannot be just that a few people are participating, that
right.
there's also a sizable part of the population involved in decision making, and that it's open to everyone to do this.
So that's essential.
Yeah.
I mean, because of the central idea of democracy is the idea that in order to advance the interests of individuals, they, in some sense, they have to, or people like them, have to stand up for those interests. They can't be advanced virtually or by other people.
Mm-hmm.
They have to be advanced by, in some sense, but at least initially, by them. And so the thought then is going to be something like, if you have a system where you have limited participation, then those people who aren't in that limited participation will see the effects of it fairly quickly.
Yeah.
And we see it in Europe and the United States before the 20th century. Working class interests and the interests of women and so on are sort of left to some degree to the side because they're not participating. Mm-hmm. And working class participation starts at the end of the 19th century, and it really takes off in the 20th century. And of course, with women, it's in the 20th century. Oh, actually, in the U.S., there are some places where it was in the 1870s and so on. But the thought is going to be, you leave a group out, mm-hmm. you're going to see that very quickly.
Yeah. Yeah.
The impact of that. Wide participation is a really important component of this whole picture. And that too, came out of my own the experience in Chicago because, these weren't problems which were totally solved, but what happened there was, you have massive problems of like police brutality in, again, African American and Latino areas. Nobody talks about it. They're not discussed.
Yeah.
And then suddenly you get this massive increase in participation of blacks and Hispanics, and it's like it starts really to come out seriously.
Yeah. And
there's a real discussion, and there's reform that takes place because of this participation. And so, I think we see this with virtually all the groups in society that when they participate, their interests are advanced. Now, of course, we live in a very unequal democracy, mm-hmm. and so the interests of worst off people and certain people are not that well advanced. They're better advanced than if they weren't in there at all, mm-hmm. but not terribly well advanced. And and I think that's because the democracy is very incomplete and very, it isn't, it's not completely realized in some sense.
Yeah. So in the field, one of the fields I work on, central banking.
Yeah.
There's also this view that central banking is this very difficult technical topic,
right? And
that for that reason it needs to be screened off from politics, right? If you would leave it to the chaotic, superficial discussions of public discourse, then the money would be mismanaged and it would become subject to electoral cycles. And
right.
The best way to make decisions here in the interest of everyone is to shield it off from democratic politics as far as possible. What do you think about this sort of topic.
I don't disagree with that. I mean, I think this is my first book. The question is how to make democracy compatible with a division of labor in political decision making. Mm-hmm. And to some degree, in a division of labor and political decision making, you need some elements of expertise which have some insulation from other parts of the society. Mm-hmm. So you want some kind of insulation. I think it's with central banking that's going to be an important case of that. But we see it in science and environmental science and so on. You want insulation, but it seems to me you also want a significant amount of accountability, mm-hmm. because of course if you just allow central bankers to make decisions for everybody else in the society, well, we have an idea of whose interests are going to be advanced. Mm-hmm. And it's not going to be the interests of the poor or the worse off, it's going to be the interests of elites and so on. But if you make central bankers, at least to some degree, accountable, and of course there are accountability mechanisms in all the democracies we know for central bankers. And I don't know if they're sufficient or adequate, but because I haven't studied this particular branch that deeply. But if you make them to some degree accountable, then they are going to be responsive to a much broader array of interests, I think. I think I think this is a problem with all of the application of all of sort of scientific theories and scientific communities in a democratic society. I mean, they're absolutely necessary mm-hmm. to the proper creation of policy. Mm-hmm. And they have to have some kind of insulation in order to do that. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, if they're overly insulated, then the interests of large numbers of people aren't going to be satisfied. So in the case of environmental science, it's very easy to see you can develop ways of restricting pollution, but where the effect, however, is to damage the welfare of, say, poor people who live in neighborhoods that aren't mm-hmm. so well protected, and where people aren't paying attention. Yeah. Because just the scientists who live in the nice neighborhoods yeah. who are doing it. Yeah. So you need this accountability, I think. I think you also need an accountability to some degree, and this is harder to specify clearly. My guess is there aren't going to be highly. I don't know how to determine it. Although maybe you're coming up with some such principles, but it's hard to specify the exact nature of this accountability. You also want, I think, the science to some degree to be accountable mm-hmm. to people. Because you want the science to be taking into account the interests of a wide variety of people. Mm-hmm. So if you have an economic theory that is unresponsive to the interests of workers who have very little by way of endowment and so on, you might have a very beautiful mathematical model, but it may not say anything that of interest to advance the interests of these people. Mm-hmm. And so I think that even the theorizing itself has to be, to some degree, responsive to interests. Yeah.
So how would that look concretely in terms of institutions?
Yes.
Is this more of a moral responsibility of individual researchers, or do you think there's also an institutional dimension where you would really...
I think it's both.
Of course, a worry that if you have political institutions governing research, that might also distort the...
Right. No, I know. So this is the tension that has to be resolved, but it has to be both. It's got to be the moral responsibility of individuals. But if you take democratic theory seriously, mm-hmm. you can't just leave it to the moral responsibility of individuals. I mean, think of 19th century America or Britain, right? So there you have maybe the mid-19th century, wealthy white men who are in control of the society. Now, I'm sure many of them took it as their responsibility to be concerned with the interests of everybody in the society, but they didn't, because they don't really know very much about it, and they don't know that much about women or poor people or anything else like that. And so, as a consequence, even if they are personally convinced of the thought that they have to do this, they can't do a good job at it. I think that's at the foundation of democratic theory, that you don't want to just leave it to the moral responsibility of persons. So you want institutions, but you're right, the danger with institutions is you don't want to construct an institution that destroys the science. You want to do it so that it, in some sense, enhances it. And it enhances it by making sure that it takes into account the interests of everybody in the society. So economics, for example, you want to construct it so that for example, if you now have economics, say, of incomplete markets and imperfect markets, then you have a question of, okay, so where are the information asymmetries? Where is the market power? Where is, and then you ask the question, well, who is it that's suffering from the exercise of market power, and who's exercising it, and so on. If you have a sort of a system, a community of economists who are completely disengaged, for example, from, say, working class politics, they may not pay attention to this phenomenon. They may want to, in some sense, but they may not be paying attention to it. So you need institutions that says, okay, no, you have to think about this too. I'm not telling you what to think, but this is something you have to think about, and you've got to have a theoretical response to this, right? What kinds of institutions do you have for that? Well, I think to some degree, the institutions of civil society do that in democratic societies. So, of course, in the case of democratic societies, what's done in the United States and in Europe and in other advanced industrial countries, our unions have played some significant role in trying to develop expertise that in some sense takes into account the interests of these people, and that and that interact with a lot of other economists so as to produce viable theories that take everyone's interests into account. That's one thing. And well, now unions, of course, are not. They're not institutions that survive spontaneously all the time. They're often institutions that require some political support for their existence. So there is, a reason there for the political system to give some support to this, because it's going to be an essential source of knowledge about large and important parts of the society. And it has to be then tied up with the universities and so on. So that's one example. It's an example I've been thinking about because, so this is connected to some degree with contemporary politics, which I think are very worrisome, certainly in the United States and in parts of Europe especially, which is the tendency of working class and lower middle class people to tend towards some populist solutions, to be moved by demagoguery and so on. So the question is, well, first of all, why is this happening? What is it that can stop this from happening? And I think I'm not a social scientist, although I think of myself as having to think about these social scientific issues. But I think that, plausible hypothesis about why it's happening is because of the decline of working class institutions that in some sense have in the past given sort of more rational articulations of interests that can be, that can affect the society. Mm-hmm. So, my sense is that unions have played, for example, a very important role not only in economic, bargaining with firms and so on. They have also played a very important political intermediary role in enhancing the political understanding and information of ordinary sort of working class citizens. Mm-hmm. That's a project that I'm sort of working on now. Not necessarily the unions just by itself, but institutions that can enhance that kind of information among ordinary citizens.
Yeah. So that's interesting. Thinking about equal participation in terms of these broader institutions, right?
Yeah.
So unions. Representation of individuals in specific scientific disciplines.
Yeah.
These sort of mid-level institutions between the individual and the state. So would you say that there's also a shift in your thinking on this topic, where you've certainly your early work really emphasized the resources that individuals have to exercise power, to influence decisions, where you're now talking more about these broader institutions, about the role of expertise, about the idea of democracy also having all these different sides in society and together allowing individuals to participate.
I think you're right. I mean, I think there is a change in focus. In some sense, it's part of the idea that I had in my first book, The Rule of the Many, which was, the intermediary institutions are essential to making democracy work at the representative level. So I had some, ideas about how to structure them, but they were much more general and more abstract in some sense than. Now I'm sort of thinking more about, but maybe we can try to be a little bit more concrete. I mean, I don't want to be too concrete because, because first of all, because I don't want to get lost in. I want to. I think there's a role for someone who does political philosophy, and that is to connect different disciplines with each other, and that requires understanding of different disciplines. But I don't want to entirely, at least at this point, I'm not thinking in terms of becoming a theorist of, say, unions, but rather to say, okay, here's the way the general democratic theory works. Here's what you need in order for these democratic institutions work, and then hopefully to inspire further research in these other areas. Because studying unions is a lifetime study. It's and so I wouldn't think I wouldn't think that I'd be able to do that just on my own, but this general problem of institutions being necessary for connecting citizens to the state. So the Rule of the Many, the institution I focused on the most were political parties. But then my thought has been that, there are other institutions that have to connect political parties with citizens as well, and then you need these other civil society institutions. So right now I'm working on a project whereby it's actually going back to the book, The Rule of the Many, which is trying to work out a theory of how democracy is possible and how it can be sustained or improved in the light of the fact that most citizens operate with what is called low information rationality.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so the question is, how do you make this work when actually people only have a certain amount of time and energy to devote to politics? Even even pretty fairly conscientious people have only a certain amount of time and energy for that. And that's going to be, the idea is going to be, well, it's through intermediate institutions that help do that. That's what lowers the amount of information that individual citizens need to make rational decisions about how they want the society to go. So that's the sort of the current project and I've been thinking about unions in that context, because and if you follow, the theoretical idea that's in the background here is this book. I don't know if you probably know it well. I mean, it is Anthony Downes's Economic Theory of Democracy, right? So Downes has this wonderful book, and he argues about this sort of low information rationality that's operating. Downes is not a skeptic of democracy, as some of the sort of contemporary people who claim to be talking about Downes are. Yeah. He's not a skeptic. Yeah. But he is he's a little skeptical about equality. He thinks that may be a problem.
Yeah.
And
could you explain the argument in more detail?
Yeah, I will. I'll explain that.
Yeah,
because I'll explain that because that's also So the Downesian argument is that given this reality of low information politics, well, let me explain what that is too. So he has this basic idea of economics of information. So the idea is each person will invest in acquiring information to the extent that, it uses the traditional economic approach, which is that the marginal cost of getting the information is equal to the marginal benefit of the information. And so, but for Downes, the thought is going to be the marginal benefit of the information is really unclear and is not very great, although he doesn't specify very clearly what the benefit is. If you thought everybody was just self-interested, then the marginal benefit would be near zero, and then nobody would do anything. But I don't think he thinks that, or at least most of the time he doesn't think it. So he leaves it somewhat open.
Yeah.
But the way he thinks about it is, if you think in terms of the economics of information, so what am I going to do to get more information? He thinks of it in a couple of different stages. The first stage is what he calls the stage of free information. You have to have, in some sense, the way he's thinking about it is you have to have free information in order to think about what more information you want to have, that you want to get, right? Because otherwise, how do you even know there is a political system?
Yeah.
You got to have the idea, well, there's a political system and there's these parties, and you got to have some free information.
Yeah.
So now his view is that, but free information depends on, who you hang out with, what your job is, who your friends are, who your, workmates are, and so on. Maybe, what television stations you watch to some degree, because you'll get some news, maybe by accident, but you'll nevertheless get it. You get this free information, and so what he wants to say is, and this is quite a striking phenomenon, he says the thing about, relatively well-to-do people is that they have jobs that give them pretty good free information about politics. Because they have to know something about the law. They have to know something about what the government is doing in order to do their jobs. So as far as politics is concerned, the information's free. They get it in order to do their jobs, there the marginal benefit is very high, but then they can use that information for politics. Okay, and so he thinks this gives them a much better start in how to understand politics than other people.
There's an optimistic take about a lot of highly educated jobs as well.
Yeah, it is optimistic, but it's only a relative take, right? Yeah. So in other words, the thought is going to be it's not that it's great; it's just that it's better.
Yeah.
Now, I think probably that's right to some degree, except what he neglects, and I think there are some problems in the way he's thinking about some of these institutions, but what he neglects is the fact that, well, actually, that's one of the functions that unions have traditionally played in the world. We usually think of unions as playing a role in advancing people's interests against the particular firms and companies that they're working with, and that's certainly an important role. But the other thing role that they play is they communicate to workers, what are important features of their working environment that are connected with the law and that are connected with the political system and so on. And so they create a kind of free information base from which people can start to ask sort of rational questions about the society that they're living in. But still, Downs, wants to say, but still there's some kind of inequality here. Again, he's sort of neglecting unions, but maybe even if you have unions, there's still some inequality there. Of course, he thinks the inequality also arises from the fact that elites are ones that are more often connected with sources of information, like the news and so on. And so he thinks that those sources are going to have some bias towards elite interests. And of course, they have more income, and so the marginal cost of spending money to get political information in some sense is relatively lower in a sense. So you have a variety of sources of inequality here that make it the case that elites, that the society, the way Downs thinks of it, the way he puts it quite flatly is he says political equality is just not to be expected in a society. Once we think of information as an essential part of political participation, and you're not going to see much. You're not going to see that much political equality. But what I want to say is, there is a lot to that, but there are institutional ways of helping fix the problem for working class and ordinary citizens. So I think unions are one, maybe even worker participation in firms are another, because after all, then they have to learn, what they can do, what they can't do, what the law is, what the law isn't, and so on. So they get the free information to some degree that Downs is saying these wealthy people get. And I think we have some evidence, although this is only a hint of evidence. If you know the work of Larry Bartels, that book, Unequal Democracy, he says, senators, and Martin Gilens has the same thing, senators and representatives, they tend to be much less responsive to ordinary citizens than to wealthy citizens, right? And so there's some sort of correlation. There's been some recent work by a number of political scientists which have argued, I think, on statistically much more sophisticated methods, that in fact, when you look at neighborhoods where there is a lot, or representative districts, there's a lot of union activity, you find the representatives are much more responsive to those people than to other people. And so that makes a difference to this responsiveness.
So the skeptical case of Bartels, if I'm correct, is that he shows that in cases where there's disagreement between rich, well-collected elite voters and more working class voters, then senators, representatives very often or almost always go for the views of the more elite voters, and given that there is actually often some overlap between what both working class voters think and what elite voters think, we don't notice. But if we focus on these exceptional cases, then, or like this subset of cases where they diverge, we'll see that just
and that's what this other new research is contesting. It's saying, no, actually you see increased responsiveness to workers and lower middle class, working class people when you see an increased presence of unions in a certain district. And that's a quite striking phenomenon. Now, of course, why that is, is it because they're better informed? Or is it because there's more money that's it's organized by the unions? That's not totally separated out here. But it is an intriguing piece of data that suggests at least a little bit of a response to the skepticism of the Bartels-Gillens type approach, because their approach is not that sophisticated ultimately.
Well, that's also the strength of the research in a way, right? It just so basically looks at what do representatives do in these conflict cases, but I see that there might be all sorts of room for intermediate cases where then suddenly unions get this decisive role. This also fits very well with the experience in the Benelux, where you see that in Walloon, where you have very strong unions still, which also have that role in representing working class voters, also a strong social democratic party. The policies have gone much less in a third way direction, and also there's not in a similar way a populist right wing party, whereas in other parts of the Benelux the disconnect has been much greater between working class voters and the traditional social democratic parties. So in the Netherlands, the Social Democratic Party are currently at under 10% of the voters. It's really
a disaster.
Collapsed as not only a power in a parliament, but also in this broader role that you are suggesting. So if you look at that context, where there has been this breach of trust between working class voters and the social democratic parties, what do you think is the way forward, right? So how do you recreate this broad participation, this intermediate level of representation between citizens and political institutions?
Well, I guess my own. I don't think this is going to work so much. I don't think it'll work as well for the Netherlands. But my own sense generally is that the strengthening of unions is part of this. Part of what improves it. I mean, so in the U.S. and in France, where you see this significant rise of populism, you have also precipitous decline of unions in the last 30 or 40 years. France is even more recent, but very, very massive decline. And so, I guess the hope would be, the strengthening of those unions, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this afternoon, but the abandonment of the idea that I think most economists have abandoned, of the idea that you should just let markets work on their own without intervention. Because the traditional economic vision is of perfectly competitive markets as the thing to which markets approximate. So once you use perfectly competitive markets as the thing to which markets are approximating, then unions and all these other things seem like total distortions. But once you think of markets, as I think most economists think of them now, as incomplete and imperfect, then, it's not always the case that increasing the amount of distortion makes things worse. Sometimes increasing the distortion makes it better, as in the theory of the second best, right? Now, it seems to me that though that message, I think, is more and more in economics, it's not yet fully been absorbed in the political system, where people are still moved by this kind of thing.
Well, I think this is a very recent thing that institutions like the IMF, central banks, are coming out with pro-union arguments, arguing for more rising wages, and then hoping that unions are going to step in to
make some difference,
to make that happen. There's of course also been a more structural shift in the past decades from manufacturing to more services.
Right, that's right.
Which also make it more difficult
to
unionize certain things. Aren't we now just expecting a bit too much from unions?
It could be. It could be.
What would be sort of institutions that could complement unions in fulfilling this role?
I mean, the other possible kind of institution would be to enhance or increase workplace democracy or workplace participation. Because that too, I think, has some of the impact of, well, now once a person has to take some responsibility for how their workplace is organized, they have to have some understanding of what the law is and what the government is doing and what all of these different issues. And so that's going to enhance the level of understanding as well. So that may be another possibility. I don't know to what extent that can be used. The other thing is we might want to look at unions that aren't merely grounded in a particular firm or a particular industry. So if you take service industry, you can take service employees and unionize them and then have them negotiate in some sense with firms. And then you have a wide base, which, so that might be another way to do it. But at this point, what I've been trying to do is trying to understand what it is that has made unions or other such institutions worthwhile, with the hope that if unions themselves aren't coming back, which is a possibility, certainly in the US, we can extend this operation to some other kind of institution. But at this point, I don't know yet what other institution. Unless we change the way, certainly in the US, the way unions operate, which is use them on a much more industry-wide basis than on a company-wide basis, then it's hard to see how they're going to help in the case of the service industry, which is very much more decentralized. And that's the basic. See, the thing is that so the question is, so what is it that we're looking for? We're looking for institutions that, in some sense, bring together economic issues and questions with political ones. So that's what's the nice thing about unions. That here you are, you participate in a union, you're trying to get your firm or your company or maybe even your industry to negotiate with you to improve wages and working conditions and so on. But in the meantime, you also are learning about what the relationship is between you, for example, and the law and the political system, because there's what making these unions and the legal arrangements possible. Okay. And so what you do then is you you simultaneously have the economic pressure or countervailing power element and the political information element. Mm-hmm. So what we're looking for are institutions that do both of these things. Why economic things? Well, I think because that's what it seems to me that's the place where we're looking for sort of rational political solutions as to in the structuring of economic institutions. In the U.S., one intermediary institution which I think is a little frightening as an intermediate, at least in some cases, are churches, because that's also where people get a lot of free political information. Yeah. But I think in some cases it's actually very valuable. But in other cases, I think it just mixes the fantastical with the political, and then produces something very strange. And so that's, I don't think it's a fully happy solution. Mm-hmm. Obviously, in Europe, it's not going to work that well because not that many people go to church on a weekly basis. Mm-hmm. But in the U.S., I think, I don't know what it is, but probably about 50 or 60% of the population is going to church on a weekly basis. So they're getting something out of that. Mm-hmm. But I don't know how good that is with politics in the U.S. Anyways, it's that kind of institution, and the fact is that it seems to me that we need institutions which enhance the economic power of workers anyway. We already need those. So if we can develop those, and those will probably involve a certain amount of worker participation, like unions or something like that, then those are going to be a site for more rational information development.
Okay, well, I think this is a very interesting discussion to focus so much on this very specific institution in the context of the much broader democratic problems and issues that have come up in the past years. Maybe just thank you for your time.
Okay.
And
thank you.
Look forward to the lecture this afternoon.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good.